So I will introduce both Eliot and Ceres. Eliot McIntire is a research scientist with the CFS, Canadian Forestry Service, with Natural Resources Canada. He's been working on landscape modeling and fire effects for over 20 years. Currently, he's the lead scientist for the Predictive Ecology Lab and has been working to bring better forecasting tools to the decisions and policies surrounding forest management and land use planning. Ceres Barros, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it today. Ceres is an ecosystem modeler who's been working with vegetation models since her PhD in Grenoble, France. Her main interests lie in understanding how complex ecosystems respond to change, particularly of disturbance regimes. In the past, she's modeled the impact of land use and climate change on mountain ecosystems in the French Alps and on terrestrial food webs across Europe. She came to Canada to work on the LIM project when it started, which she found extremely rewarding. And yeah, I'll leave it to you to take away there. Eliot?
Okay, thank you. Just doing a sound check. Can I get a thumbs up from a video, Dave, or voice confirmation?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, and you can see my shared screen and video, it looks like.
Yes, you're good.
Oh, okay, so thank you very much. And as the modeling group, I will be anchoring the 3 presentations from the researchers today. So the title that we've given this talk is Computer Simulations of Historical Fires in the Foothills Suggests They Were Mixed Severity. What does this mean going forward? And so Ceres is the one who did the majority of this work in my lab. And she is on maternity leave right now. And so she is, I have the joy and pleasure of presenting this work. It's unfortunate that she's not going to be here because she has a lot of other insights than I do as well. So for today, I'm going to just briefly go through things like the modeling team and what is a mixed fire severity from a modeling perspective and how and why are we studying it. I'll be brief on these 2 parts. So the core of this presentation is about this middle section, developing models of mixed severity fire regimes. So what it means to be a simulation system, how do we bring in the fact that trees die and trees recover into these systems. And then finally, when looking at some of the results, it's about really determining whether we captured the fire system in a way that we're happy with, and then take home messages and where we go next. We've seen the Mountain Legacy Project and the Tree Ring Lab and the dendrochronology team. So we are this predictive ecology lab where we really focus on forecasting and building tools to help management decision in forecasting type situations. So the hope has been that we will be a way to bring together the 3 teams, the information from 3 teams to understand the mixed severity fire regimes in Southwest Alberta foothills. So Cameron, well, everybody so far has talked about this mixed severity and fire severity. And I just want to identify, essentially it's like a subset of what the larger conversation is about. So from our modeling perspective, we have this notion of looking at maps. And so if you look at a particular map, you could imagine it has areas or pixels in it, and that could be described with a forest condition. So on the left, it might be a mature pine forest, and that looks like, and middle would be a forest that has some burn and some not burn, and on the right it has a location that is fully burned, and with all trees above ground, trees killed. So what we are attempting to do is to understand when and where each of these conditions and sort of everything in between will be created. So how it's a combination of understanding what trees are there, as well as how the fires occur, where they occur, and what they do to these conditions. That's sort of the challenge on the modeling side, and I'll sort of revisit that again. And I'll briefly go through some of these because John Statt talked about this. We use this, one of the reasons is to look at the natural range of variation. There are other reasons to look at mixed severity fire regimes, which include the fact that, well, this is the reality for the species, plants, and animals that live there. And so there's questions of diversity and wildlife and habitat use. And of course, then when it, from our perspective, one of the big things that we are interested in is trying to predict the changes or forecast the changes in these landscapes. So forecasting fire regimes and ecosystems. And this becomes particularly relevant as the future becomes different than the past. As my PhD supervisor, Hamish Kimmons at UBC said, if the past and the future were expected to be the same, most of the challenges of land management would be relatively straightforward. Our reality is that the future doesn't tend to be a replicate of the past. And so that's really the core of some of the research questions and approaches that we are facing. So the next component is, how do we study mixed severity fire? So we've looked at the photography perspective, and I wanted to just highlight also the fact that aerial photography has been very useful. Dave Anderson presented a little bit of this, and you can see on the left an aerial photo of a fire event. On the right is an interpreted version of that from a severity perspective. The red here is the most severe that appears on this landscape. I guess there's a few tiny patches of purple. And then as you get to green, it's unburnt and yellow, low severity. So a single fire event obviously can have all of these things in it. And our job is not necessarily to say, well, this creates a mixed severity fire regime. Rather, our job is to try to recreate this richness in our models. Of course, dendroecological analysis, as we just saw with Cameron, and paleoecological analyses occurs as well. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of this talk about this modeling stuff. So one of the things we try to do is bring in the data and understanding that comes from data sources like photography, bring in data sources like dendroecological analyses and others, and really try to recreate in a computer system something that reproduces the real fires as closely as possible, and not just the fires themselves. It's also about the recovery after the fires and how that happens. So this sort of approach, taking a modeling perspective on this, is what we think of as being very important for prediction, because we can get so many different types of complexity and types of interactions that it's hard to just say without integrating all this science and data. It's hard to just say what's going to happen. Okay, so I'm going to jump into a little bit about what the developing models of mixed severity fire regime looks like. And the three parts I'm going to talk about are about the simulation system. So in this project, we made new components and we adopted existing components of a simulation system that can handle mixed severity fires in a complex forest. That was one of the principal jobs that we had and attempted to do. And a simulation system is basically like that image we saw of the pixels burning in that little pretend landscape. We're trying to initiate fires and spread them through a landscape in a way that does a good job at matching what the real fires have done. The second component, trees die, I'll dive into this a little bit. It's how many, what kind, and where, and then the responses. What happens after trees die, regeneration and growth or regrowth, survival, and islands. So in this simulation system, we're using a toolkit called SPADES. the central piece for what we do is something that represents the trees, the above ground biomass of trees. And that's this core piece that we look at. And of course, that requires a lot of data for any given study area. So this one is no different. So we collect and compile existing maps of species and vegetation data, as well as things that are not mapped. And we try to bring those in so that our that middle biomass part about trees is as good as we can get it. So it's describing what is there and what is potentially going to happen there into the future. So then, of course, in a simulation system like with the trees in it, we can bring in something that does burning. And so we call that here fire spread. The connection, to connect these two things from the trees to the fire spread component, we have to basically convert the biomass, the trees, the above ground trees, to some representation of their fuels, how that contributes from a fire's perspective into fuels. And then, of course, we go the other way. So if fire has spread through a landscape, we want to return to that tree, that core piece about the trees, and say, okay, well, where in this landscape is there regeneration or resprouting or just continued growth that may perhaps be slowed down or sped up by the fire? In order to really convert the fuels to the dynamics of fire spread, we actually have to bring in, of course, the other components that are not just related to fuels, like topography and weather. And we do that in this case through the fire behavior prediction system that was created with the federal government a number of years ago. And so we use that here to really bring together the fuels and the other components to drive the fire models. And so this simulation system, we can understand, let's say, the current, we can look at the current or past forest condition and then place fires on that landscape and burn things and then let the landscape recover, and then we can go forward in time and we can continue to spread perhaps in new places. We have to ignite fires, and then they recover, and this cycle can keep going. And we create this thing called a simulation system that allows us to look through and forecast from any point. It could be from a past point going forward in time, or from the present and going forward in time, or we could do any sorts of other types of things. Look at the historical range of variation is a really important one, for example. We can reframe this with, this is exactly the same thing as I just showed you, but looking at it with a slightly different representation. So, in the middle here, we have, these trees that are cycling through various stages, recruitment, regeneration, growth, mortality, seed production, resprouting, and they keep getting affected or modified by various things, including seed dispersal, light and shading, and fire and aging. And so fire is a component that we really worked on for this particular project, but the recovery and from that is also important. Okay, so this mortality and severity is next. How do we address that sort of thing? So it's sometimes very challenging because it's rare to have a perfect data set that describes the entire spatial and temporal dynamics of everything that we need to know about every fire that's ever existed. So we have to piece together things. So similarly, analyzing severity data isn't always very simple, and the relationships can be very messy. So for example, what caused a particular place to burn extremely hot, but another right next to it less hot? Clearly there's going to be some combination of weather and fuel and topography that are going to interact in complex ways. So this on the right is a map of a single fire event that was interpreted into severity classes. And so our problem is because unburned and burned parts of a fire and everything in between are affected by different causes. So of course, an unburned area might remain unburned because there was a physical fire barrier, or there was water or non-forested vegetation that had low fuel load. It could be because of weather with very wet conditions, something about there, also topography. Why did some places get very severely burned? Well, clearly something about extreme weather is probably important there, but the other locations that weren't might have had the same extreme weather. Possibly there was very flammable vegetation and very dry conditions in the fuels there, and of course topography as well. And those intermediate spots are probably going to be any rich combination of all of those factors combined with somewhere between a little bit or a lot of randomness. So a major piece of what we spent time on was to build a much richer set of statistical models that are relating the conditions in this fire example. In this example, what were the forest conditions and the weather conditions, and how did it create this? So we spent a lot of time trying to understand and do a better job at predicting those. And I'm not going to present much of that stuff right now. Suffice to say, we brought that stuff into the next stage of this simulation system. Okay, so we have a simulation system. We tried to understand what drives trees to die. So the next piece is, what about recovery? And so that is where we started to connect these fire pieces. We go through this group of model pieces, and we have these two components here. There's partial mortality regenerating piece, and then the no partial mortality regenerating piece. And what is different here, this PM, this is what we created as part of this project. And there's no PM, that's another way it means this stand replacement. So no partial mortality is the same as stand replacement, and it'll be shown as no PM throughout. Basically, we're trying to look at how can we bring this new piece in, and how good a job does it do at recreating the landscape, and is it better than the sort of more simplified example of just stand replacing situations? So this is we went through a few phases of our modeling steps. The first one was we just tried to put on a giant large fire in the south and just look at what happened. And you can sort of, you'll see on the top, it's cycling through a 5-year window, 5-year steps of what this landscape looks like. And it's about at year 10 where there's this big fire we introduce. And you can see the recovery up to year 65 is a lot of lodgepole pine and aspen. On the right-hand side, you have this partial mortality version running, and on the left-hand side is the that stand replacing version. And this was just one example of many that we started with, and it's just sort of was an interesting one to sort of visualize. The results that came from this were that the recovery in a stand replacing situation, and I'm looking at the text on the left here now, is that there were lodgepole pine benefited greatly in the stand replacing situation. The landscape also became very quickly homogenized because these stands were cleared with potentially large fires and then replaced with relatively simple forests. The partial mortality version, we got what we were hoping for, which is, of course, something that in many places where there was Douglas fir, it really benefited Douglas fir. And it created a landscape that is much more heterogeneous. And I've listed off some of the tree traits here at the bottom in this little table. And one of the traits that we use is this fire resistance. And Douglas fir is this one that is resistant to fire. And so that's sort of how we achieve this result of that Douglas fir is benefited, because we impose a fire that wasn't as severe, and Douglas fir is able to survive that. Of course, and the lodgepole pine and aspen are still going to do just fine in many places. So this figure here is another one example again of a landscape that, you know, on this this x-axis here is a year axis, and it's sort of starting from conditions that we have now on the landscape at time 0, and we're simulating or forecasting for 100 years. And what we see here is at this beginning part here, we can see that there's, you know, a little bit of fir, a little bit of Douglas fir, a lot of pine on that landscape, and, you know, large amounts of white spruce and Engelmann spruce. And in the upper graph, this is the stand replacing fire regime. Excuse me, I did not mean to press forward on that. Stand replacing fire regime here. And you see that lodgepole pine actually increases over 100 years if we are simulating with a stand replacing or no partial mortality fire regime. And we also have trembling aspen here. It increases a lot. In this new piece that we have added is this mixed severity piece, and it's quite a different story. And in that case, we have Douglas fir that actually increases its abundance, and lodgepole pine decreases. It's still, there is abundant lodgepole pine and, you know, abundant white spruce and Engelmann spruce, but really the biggest difference here is that we are maintaining Douglas fir on the landscape. So this was one of the things that we knew clearly was going to be inappropriate with the stand replacing, you know, simulation system that we were using before this project. So lots more of that. This is good, and this is where previous models fell short. So in converting that figure to a couple maps is what this is essentially doing. And on this pair here is land cover maps. And we see on the left-hand side is this stand replacing a map. If we had simulated this landscape with stand replacing fires, and you get lots of blue throughout here. And in the Porcupine Hills, we actually have, you know, not very much Douglas fir. In this partial severity, partial mortality simulation, we create a landscape that certainly has lots of lodgepole pine in it, but the abundance of Douglas fir, especially in the southern portions of the study area, is quite a bit more important. And this is, we simulated the same number of fires in both of these cases. The only thing that was different is the severity. And we got a few things that were matching quite nicely with what Cameron just presented, where we get these older Douglas fir forests that are through this landscape. And we also get a more heterogeneous landscape. There's more different things happening. And these two graphs on the bottom just reflect exactly what I've been saying throughout, where in the stand replacing condition, there was less Douglas fir, and in the partial mortality, we get more, and the other abundances shift accordingly. And we get a lot more, we still have lots of young forest in this blue, but we do have more of these old forests, which are predominantly that Douglas fir. Okay, there are, Cameron talked about heterogeneity of these forests. And so we definitely were able to capture that. And this is this index of diversity as an index of landscape heterogeneity. And this is diversity of forest types. And so from the beginning of time 0 through to the 100 years, that becomes, it's much more diverse. And so this is a representation, it seems to be a good representation that reflects the type of information that Cameron presented and, you know, also Mary presented, where the landscape in that historical condition, if we were driving it with these historical mixed severity fires, we would be creating a landscape that looks much more heterogeneous. So there are also obviously partially surviving stands, maintenance of some older cohorts in some places, and lower tree density. So this is consistent with across all three of the teams that you've seen today, and we were able to capture some of that. So to reiterate with just two final slides here of results, we were trying to reproduce historical condition. And that means a lot of different things. And one of the things that we tried to do was just reproduce the range from 1960 to 1990, where we had fires just from the actual fire record, not from the dendrochronology work. And the blue is what we predicted with our model, and this is just the number of fires in each year, and the pink was the observed fires. And we obviously, something went very well with this approach in terms of predicting the number of fires over this time sequence. And every single year that happens, 1960, 1961 through to 1990, and then going forward, we generate this probability of fire ignition map, and that is sort of reflected here. And so we apparently did a very good job at producing a map and a process that represents or that reflects what we actually experienced during these decades. And this second slide here, this is comparing our modeling team to the dendro team's outputs. What I want you to look at here is this figure, and this is not time anymore. This is a difference. And so this is a difference between the forest ages from the dendro work and our modeling work. And if we are perfectly representing the dendrochronology results, everything, all these dots that you're seeing here should line up right on the zero. That means there's no difference between the dendro results and ages and our ages. And there are many reasons why it won't ever be exactly zero. But what we did do is our stand replacing simulations, they produced something that was quite different in these Douglas fir ecosystems. The partial mortality was almost 40% better. The deviation was 30 to 40% better on these Douglas firs. And we got some other small improvements on the other things, but they were sort of balanced out by pieces that got a little bit worse. But the real difference here was about the mixed severity component related to Douglas fir. So we definitely got much closer to recreating the landscapes that the data have been showing. So some of the take-home messages. The model simulation system appears to perform adequately and certainly better with the new additions that we added. In particular, the partial severity fire model that we implemented is certainly recovering a number of dimensions in a much better way. The trees responded to this fire burning in a way that fits better with on-the-ground dendro data, including a better representation of forest types, and then a higher diversity of forest types. The new models presented here are, of course, just one component of any future or modeling and decision-making. So this is just the first step of the utility of the models that we were able to produce. And this model, of course, can and should be updated with new information, new data, and new insights regularly as we get new data. And some of this we have been able to build into sort of automated processes as we get new fire information. It just sort of is able to update some of the results as we go. So the next steps. Well, there are a lot of possibilities, and of course, so we can use this system for future projections that could help with identifying fire risk, where and when fires might occur in the future, and how severe they will be. Obviously, working with Alberta government and as John Statt said, forest management under this mixed severity fire regime. Understanding how this all relates to resilience, especially under changing climate, because it has a different meaning than what some people think of as resilience, because it's not simply how do we maintain what we had in the past. That's not going to be an objective for under the banner of resilience anymore. And of course, impacts on water and recreation and other uses. This last one I added as how do we reconcile this situation where the past certainly looks like it has a mixed severity fire regime with a future that may be changing, and the recent past had not very many fires, and the future could have much higher severity fires. And so the reason for building the models as we did was climate is part of this. And so we can actually forecast how much the changing conditions and climate will be forecasting higher severity fires than historically, which is a very exciting thing that we are interested in doing. So with that, I will end, and to say thank you to the co-authors, which were listed at the beginning, but also a few other people at the Canadian Forest Service, Dan Parakis and Steve Taylor, Francis Stewart and Tati Micheletti. And with that, I will end and take questions if there are, is there time, or we can simply jump straight to the next phase.